In the middle of all of this wireless networking, commonly there's an access point. Now, we've talked about access points before. Let's actually connect to one. We can talk through some of the configuration settings. Now, I've got a Linksys access point. I'm actually running a custom piece of firmware called DDWRT. You can put this on a lot of different access points that have the right processor and have the ability to do firmware uploads. The functionality is primarily the same. This exposes a few extra features that you can get to and do some additional things with the hardware. What I've got here is just the control panel. Now, it's pretty common for access points to have this web interface so that you can do administration and customization, all of the configuration settings you would do through this web interface. Now, if you were working on an enterprise level access point, you may have a different set of configuration settings. There are a wide variety of these enterprise level, but really what you're talking about for the most part is the same sort of things. Now, we've got here, let me go to the setup, and it's going to ask me for my password. Now, we're into the configuration settings here. This is just the basic setup. I've got a place that I can set my router name, and then I'm going to set my local IP address. In this case, I've got a DHCP server. Most consumer access points have DHCP servers associated with them so that I can hand out IP addresses to all of my clients on my wireless network. I can go to MAC address cloning. This would be used if I was connecting to either a DSL service or a cable modem service where it used a MAC address to associate with, and we talked about MAC addresses previously. My service provider may actually require a MAC address to tie me to, and if they have tied me to a MAC address that belongs to my computer because that's what they use to set the system up, and I add this in later, I may want to clone my MAC address. Now, if we go over to the wireless section here, I've got some options. I can do a wireless client. I could do a client bridge. I could become just an ad hoc wireless network, and we've talked about that before. In the case of network mode, this has to do with the mode of 802.11 that we're going to be using. I'm going to be using mixed here because I may have a bunch of G or N network clients, and I may actually have some B clients as well. So I'm going to accept pretty much anything that comes my way. Now, here's the SSID. This is the service set identifier. I could change this to be anything I want. It doesn't really matter what it is here. Anything that I wanted my wireless network to be known by so people could find me easily. Now, we've got the wireless channel. This is the different channels that belong to the 2.4 gigahertz range, and I've got a channel width. Now, I can also do some wireless security. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And we've got a whole bunch of other things that we can do settings on, and we'll get more specific about some of these when we start talking about securing your wireless network and the various things you can do in that regard. I can also check my status to determine what my CPU model is, the clock, I've got memory available, and I can also get LAN information. So I've got one active client right here, so I can get a list of all of my clients. I've got wireless status as well, and you'll see that this is actually the same client right here as was on my local area network. I've just got the one client that is me that's associated here. And you can see the amount of detail that I get right down to the transmit power, 100 milliwatts, and then my rate is 52 megabits per second. So you can get a lot of detailed information. As I said, some of this is going to be specific to DDWRT. The vendor firmware is generally going to be less detailed and slightly less feature rich than this particular open source firmware is. I'm using this just to demonstrate some of the underlying features that you may not actually see with vendor firmware. We're going to be primarily using this throughout the rest of the course as we talk about different settings. When we start talking about some of the additional features, they're going to be exactly the same in the vendor firmware as in this custom firmware. I may get a couple of additional options with this, but the settings are going to be the same. The things that you will see in the vendor firmware are also going to be available here for setting as well.